All right, so let's begin this program. I am Professor Luis Chiesa, professor of law at the University of Buffalo School of Law, and also the director of the Criminal Law Center, the Buffalo Criminal Law Center at the School of Law. And just wanted to say a couple of things about the program and how it originated. I think it was early last week. I received a call from our dean, Aviva Abramovsky, asking if there was interest on my part on having the Buffalo Criminal Law Center organize a panel discussion on the recent events after the George Floyd killing and the protests that ensued and the calls for police reform, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought it was a phenomenal idea, and the Buffalo Criminal Law Center seemed like a good place to start in terms of organizing these kinds of much needed conversations. So I'm very grateful to Dean Aviva Abramovsky for planting that seed, and to Professor Tony O'Rourke and Professor Athena Mutua for graciously agreeing to join in this panel discussion. And I hope that all of you find it helpful in sort of like wrapping your heads around what's going on. And also, I would like to note that it is my interest, and I am sure it's the interest of the dean as well, and of the law school community, to hold more discussions like this throughout the course of the coming days, weeks, and months. So many issues are arising. I just wanted to say that we are going to adopt more of a bird's eye view approach to the conversation, meaning that we are going to try to hit on as many topics as we can, including issues like police defunding or abolition, the role of police unions in what's going on, an overview of the substantive criminal law that applies in cases like George Floyd. So we're going to touch on many points, and almost by necessity, we won't be able to go in depth into each one of these points. So let this then be simply the beginning of a conversation, trying to lay a foundation for future conversations. And I've been in touch with other colleagues, and we're thinking maybe of having a panel exclusively devoted to police defunding, or a panel exclusively devoted to the role of unions in this context. So many more things to come. And I would encourage everyone listening to be on the lookout for more programs that I hope we will be able to put together. Now, before beginning, I would actually like to just take a minute or so as a moment of silence, actually, to in commemoration of George Floyd and all of the other victims of police violence in America, especially our Black brothers and sisters. So if you could just take a minute to commemorate the memory of George Floyd and all of the other people who have been killed at the hands of the police, that would be much appreciated. So let's do that now. Thank you. Thank you all. So let us then begin a program. A couple of reminders before we do so. At the end of this conversation, the law school will send all of the registered attendees a very useful reading list, which includes links to articles and books that discuss many of the topics that we're going to be discussing here today and many more. It's a very useful starting point to try and be a little bit more informed as to the issues that are arising as a result of, uh, of the current environment. So be on the lookout for that. In terms of the format, I just wanted to very quickly say that we are going to touch on different topics, as I said. I'm not a fan of hiding the ball. This isn't a mystery novel, so I'm actually going to tell you now which topics we're going to discuss, so that if you have questions and answers, you can wait, to when your topic is discussed. So we're going to begin with a quick overview of the substantive criminal law that applies in the case of George Floyd. We're going to then briefly talk about procedural hurdles in the prosecution of the officers in cases like George Floyd and others, hurdles to conviction. And so that would be most of the meat of like the substantive and procedural law and practices. But after that, then we will move on to some more macro level issues that aren't directly legal. And so we're going to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. We're going to talk about the reasons why these protests feel different than prior protests. We're going to talk about whether police defunding or abolition is an appropriate response to the problems that we face, and what exactly may that mean. We're going to talk about the role of unions and police unions in particular in this context. And yeah, so that's we're also going to talk briefly about the reasons why this protest may feel different, as I pointed out, including any interrelationship that may exist between the protest and COVID-19, particularly in the context of how it impacts Black and brown communities, and in particular Black communities more than white communities. So that's kind of like the program for today, and we have decided to have a conversation. And after that, we will open the floor up to questions using the Q&A feature. So you can type your questions. We have decided to take the questions at the end. So if possible, you can keep those questions until the end. You may find that we maybe answer some of your questions during the course of the program. All right, so without further ado, let me begin this then by briefly giving an overview of the substantive criminal law that applies in a case like George Floyd, and that governs the law with which Officer Derek Chauvin and his three colleagues at the police department have been charged. So basically, the charges here are murder in the second degree under Minnesota law. I'm not going to go into the details here. I'm just going to say that Minnesota follows, with some modification, the common law approach to homicide and murder. So, for those who took criminal law a long time ago, at common law, first-degree murder, or the worst kind of murder following the Pennsylvania statutes reforming homicide law, would be first-degree murder based on a theory of premeditation, or some kind of felony murder theory based on certain predicate felonies. And then murder in the second degree in Minnesota can actually be committed in one of two basic ways. One would be when you have an intent to kill, but no premeditation. And the other one would be a kind of felony murder, when the killing takes place during the course of a certain kind of felony. And this is actually the basis for the current second degree charge, based on the felony of assault, felonious assault. And the assault would have been when Officer Chauvin used excessive force and continued to use force, even though George Floyd was clearly not a threat anymore and had been subdued. So then I'm just going to briefly flag some potential problems here with the second degree murder charge against Officer Chauvin. I also wanted to say that second degree murder carries a punishment of 40 years imprisonment maximum, which is a lot. First degree murder would be life imprisonment in Minnesota. third degree murder, 25 years. And even unintentional, reckless, or negligent murder would be 10 years maximum. So it's a pretty punitive penalty scheme. So with regard to second degree murder, one potential issue I just want to flag for the audience is that in some states, you cannot use assault as a predicate felony for felony murder. And this is due to a doctrine called the merger doctrine. And the merger doctrine holds that when the underlying felony is assaultive in nature, you can't use it as a springboard to charge felony murder, because assault by definition endangers life, and there will be kind of like a double counting here. So I won't get into the details of that, but essentially in places where merger doctrine applies, the assault cannot be used as a predicate felony to bump up a homicide to murder. And in Minnesota, I'm not a Minnesota lawyer, obviously, but I tried to do some research. And the Supreme Court of Minnesota has actually not adopted the merger doctrine. They haven't rejected it either outright. So it would be a question of first impression. I wouldn't be surprised if defense counsel, I think, competently argues merger. There is a case, though, that I quickly wanted to point out, which is State v. Branson, decided by the Minnesota Supreme Court in '92. And this is in the context of felony murder, but not merger. So it's dictum when it comes to merger. But the Supreme Court said, in construing its second-degree murder statute, any felony not otherwise prescribed, which as committed involves special danger to human life, could serve as a predicate felony. So they said any felony. They didn't exclude assaulted felonies. And so this is a broad pronouncement which points in the direction of there not being a merger doctrine. But again, this would be a question of first impression. And if the Supreme Court of Minnesota decides that merger applies, then the second-degree murder charge based on felony murder wouldn't be able to fly in this particular case. Now, I will quickly say that there's also the possibility, obviously, of them being found guilty and Officer Chauvin being found guilty of a lesser included offense, such as, for example, murder in the third degree, which is essentially the classic sort of like depraved heart murder at common law. So this is when there's no intent to kill, but there's a reckless act that manifests gross indifference towards the value of human life, which for me can be clearly gleaned from the video, right? So from the video itself, it seems obvious to me that third degree murder is applicable at least, right? And then second degree murder, you have to deal with either intent to kill or the felony murder merger issue, right? But third degree murder feels pretty darn applicable here. And then you also have the manslaughter charges, in particular, manslaughter in the second degree, which applies to reckless or perhaps even negligent killings with a maximum punishment of 10 years, would seem to obviously apply if the murder charges don't hold. Then finally, I want to say a couple of things about the other three officers who just stood by. And with regard to those, they've been charged of aiding and abetting in the murder of George Floyd. And I've already seen rumbles of, well, you can't convict someone of aiding and abetting by omission, right? Because what they're charged in principle, I mean, it's unclear exactly. You can argue two ways. One is that they helped actively in some way restrain him, as one of them seemed to do, by the way, in the video from the backside, right? That would be uncontroversial. You're actively with your own hands or body helping. That's aiding and abetting. But what if you're standing idly by, as perhaps a couple of them were? That is not, I believe, an impediment to charging someone as an aider and accomplice. There's a lot of doctrine on the mere presence at the scene of the crime not being enough to generate accomplice liability. That's true, but mere presence coupled with either an act, however slight, or an omission when there's a legal duty to act is enough. So then the question here, even if you assume that in the case of one or two of the officers, the conduct is purely passive, meaning just being there and not interfering, if we find that they had a legal duty to act and they failed to act, and they had enough time to act, which they clearly did, because this lasted. One of the great tragedies here is that it's 8 minutes and 46 seconds, right? So they clearly had time to act. And so if you find that legal duty, then liability can be premised on an omission. In Minnesota courts, I found a case called State v. Parker, where the Supreme Court 1969 case said, the question, I'm quoting here from the case, it says, the question whether a person can aid by inaction may well be answered in the affirmative, since inaction is often the distinguishing characteristic of the aider and abettor, and is included within the statute. In this regard, the lookout is a classic example. The presence of one at the commission of a felony by another is evidence to be considered in determining whether you're guilty or not guilty of aiding and abetting. And then at the end, the court says, in the instant case, defendant was present during the criminal activity. He did nothing to prevent the offenses committed or the brutal beating which the victim endured. He must have known of the robbery and made no effort to stop it. And we think under the circumstances, his efforts, his presence and acts helped to make all the crimes possible. Therefore, his lack of objection under the circumstances supports his conviction, right? So this is pretty clear here that there can be in Minnesota liability as an aider and abettor for omission or failing to act when you have a duty to act. And then finally, and then we'll move on to the next topic, in terms of a duty to act, I want to briefly cite you to section 5-300 of the Minneapolis Police Department Policy and Procedure Manual. That section is titled Use of Force. And in section 5-303.01, titled Duty to Intervene, it says the following. Sworn employees have an obligation to protect the public and other employees. Again, this is the police manual. And then in sub B, it states, it shall be the duty of every sworn employee present at any scene where physical force is being applied to either stop or attempt to stop another sworn employee when force is being inappropriately applied or is no longer required. So this seems to just be like totally on point here. And mind you, you wouldn't need the statute. The duty can arise out of special relationships between individuals. You don't need a law. It can be a common law duty. But here you actually have a regulation that applies to the police that provides us with a very good hook for finding that duty. So I really do think that in the cases, in the case of the other police officers, even if one describes their conduct as passive, we have a case here where there seems to be a legal duty to act and a breach of that duty, and certainly enough time to act. Finally, I'll just say that there is a case in Puerto Rico, a 2009 case, where officers who were idly standing by while another shot and killed a civilian were charged with murder, and the Supreme Court, I think it was with homicide, and the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico upheld the charges, saying that police officers have a duty to prevent physical injury and death of the civilians, and if they could have acted to prevent it, then they should have, and if not, they're guilty by omission of the homicide. That's People versus Sustache, 2009 case. So anyway, that's the law. I think it's fairly clear. Like in this case, like in many others, Eric Garner, the previous case with the chokehold in New York City, basically in most, if not all of these cases, criminal liability is pretty obvious on the face of substantive criminal law. But unfortunately, what we get is that even though for someone like me who teaches substantive criminal law, criminal liability seems to be fairly obvious, we still see many of these officers being acquitted or not prosecuted. So there's different stages where we actually fail to do what needs to be done in order to secure a conviction. And I want to turn to Professor O'Rourke, to Tony, to talk a little bit more about the potential reasons why, even when the substantive criminal law is clear, cases involving police misconduct often don't lead to a conviction.
Thanks so much, Luis. It's a privilege to be here, and thank you for organizing this, and thank you to Professor Mutua as well for joining the conversation. So I think that there are two separate questions here. One is why acquittals are so rare, and the other is why aren't officers charged more? And here's a case where Officer Chauvin was charged. And in those circumstances, I think that much of what leads to acquittals might be the self-defense standard. So if you can invoke a self-defense that you reasonably believe that you were in fear, that there was a danger to your life or others, you can, I mean, you will be acquitted. And I'll let Luis jump in and speak to those issues of substantive criminal law in a bit. But I think what's interesting to me are the number of cases where there is no charge, and what it says about the cases where there is a charge. And I'll get to what I mean by that in a second. But first, why are there so few charges brought against police officers? Now, the formal answer is that there are effectively different criminal procedure standards that apply to law enforcement officers, not as a matter of constitutional law, but in practice. But in order to understand what that means, you should keep in mind the political dynamics between these laws. And I'd argue that often these laws are used to shield other political actors, not just police departments, but also cities, from accountability, and to shift blame. Now let's start with the formal law, beginning with what happens after a law enforcement officer kills someone. Well, they'll be brought in and interrogated. And as I mentioned, there's no special Fifth Amendment Miranda rules that apply in an enhanced fashion to police. But as those of you who've taken criminal adjudication or who are familiar with this in practice know, Miranda is often talked about as a rule that in some way rewards sophisticated defendants. Most defendants, when they come in and pressure is put on them to talk to the police, might not know that they have a right to remain silent, even though their Miranda rights are read and everyone can recite them from heart. But they might feel in some way psychologically that it's beneficial for them to talk. More to the point, most unsophisticated defendants might think that they can talk their way out of a charge by explaining themselves to police officers. And a special point, I think many people know full well what their rights are, what their rights to remain silent are, that they have a formal constitutional right not to speak to police officers. But in communities of color, in communities that are brutalized, they might not feel that they have an effective right. They might be afraid of the police if they don't talk. They might fear for their families' lives if they don't talk. A police officer, by contrast, doesn't have these burdens and is a sophisticated actor in the criminal justice system. So that actor will know full well to invoke Miranda, to ask for a lawyer right away. So that's how the same constitutional standards apply. But even beyond these standards, most jurisdictions, including Minnesota by statute, have what's called a Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights that provides for enhanced protections that govern the scope of their interrogation, right? Rules that say you can only be interrogated for so long, you have to have certain provisions made for you to make yourself comfortable, like breaks. The interrogation must occur at reasonable hours. And again, this is codified. This is codified in Minnesota. In most places, it's not codified, but often part of a contract. For example, the Buffalo Police Department, the collective bargaining agreements that are publicly available include a law enforcement officer bill of rights in a bargaining agreement that I think is dated. It's from 1986. I unfortunately couldn't find the more recent ones that are publicly available. But it would be surprising if there weren't one, because this is often par for the course. So criminal procedure operates differently in form and in substance when it applies to police officers. And next, think about the charging decision that prosecutors make after there has or has not been any sort of police interview. Take a normal case, right? In an era of mass incarceration, if there's a charge like the charge brought against the officer in Buffalo, second-degree assault, there might be little screening about what happens, right? There might be a police call. You're not going to have an intensive inquiry before you make the decision whether or not to charge, whether the person had a reasonable fear for their safety. You'll just charge, and maybe if there is a viable self-defense, the person will be acquitted later or the charge will be dropped, but you make the charge because you don't do any investigation or screening that would undermine your case in advance. You might not even do any investigation or screening that would help your case in advance because you are processing these charges so quickly. By contrast, in a case involving a police officer, there are a lot of institutional pressures on police officers to make sure they get it right, and to make sure that they can get a conviction. So the prosecutors will be more likely to carefully screen the charge before they bring it. They'll be more likely to interview witnesses before they decide whether or not to bring a charge. And this sort of pretrial screening might lead the officer to believe that there's a good risk that they'll lose the case, even if they have probable cause to believe that it has occurred and their ethical duty of bringing the charge is satisfied. They might still be too risk averse to bring it. And finally, if they do decide to go ahead and pursue a charge and bring it to a grand jury, we should think about what the role of the grand jury is. In most cases, as everyone will remember if they've taken criminal adjudication, the grand jury is a rubber stamp, right? There's no defendant allowed in the room. There's no defense attorney allowed in the room. There's no constitutional duty on the government to present exculpatory evidence into a grand jury, and prosecutors in most cases choose not to present exculpatory evidence. And beyond this, right, there's just the act of inurement. If you're sitting in a jury, you get tired, right? You get almost totally captured by the police officer, by the prosecutor who's conducting the grand jury and bringing the charges, because every case you see might look the same, right? You might have buy and bust case after buy and bust case after buy and bust case, or one assault that looks like another that looks like another. By contrast, in police killing cases, right, and police misconduct cases, the grand jury performs often more of an investigatory function. Prosecutors might present exculpatory evidence, right? They might present witnesses that will tell different sides of the story and sort of let the jury let the grand jury make the charging decision itself rather than marshal the grand jury toward the decision that the prosecutor wants. Most grand jury transcripts are secret, but a good example of one that isn't, that illustrates this, are the Ferguson grand jury transcripts, where in that case, the grand jury heard from dozens of witnesses over weeks of testimony. There was searching cross-examination of witnesses by prosecutors, strangely, that would undermine the case that was brought against those police officers. So this gets to the issue of what do these rules do? And to my claim or suggestion that these are mechanisms of blame shifting and insulation from accountability. It seems like in Ferguson and in a lot of grand jury cases, the act of presenting it to a grand jury and presenting exculpatory evidence allows the prosecutor to be relieved of the burden of having to pursue a case. Right? So you present a case to the grand jury, but you present it in a way that will induce the grand jury to not bring the charge. And then you as the prosecutor don't face political pressure from not having tried to bring the charge in the first place. And this gets to the political accountability, economy and the power dynamics that are behind a lot of these rules. Often local prosecutors will be reluctant to bring charges against police officers because those local police officers rely on the police officers to bring their cases. They have to maintain good relationships with their police departments. And they're not well positioned to be aggressive in those cases against rank and file, unless there is some sort of understanding among various political actors that this is an exceptional case. And even when prosecutors try to do the right thing, city governments might undermine the case for fear of accountability. To give a specific example, I watched Byron Brown's interview on Rachel Maddow, where he certainly condemned what the police officer said, what the police officer did when they pushed the officer, but seemed to be speaking in a way that is designed to avoid civil liability for the city. So he said, yes, he pushed, but after the police officer pushed this person, it didn't matter that he didn't try to pick him up. Maybe one of the most troubling things about that video, because we're trained to have immediate medical attention, and the push was against policy, but what was not against policy is our medical practices, and he received immediate medical attention almost immediately after. He didn't act within his training. The push was inappropriate, but the failure to help was not inappropriate. He then, in other contexts, referred to the victim as an agitator, and doing this does make it more likely that the city would be shielded from liability because there was no deviation from policy. But it also might undermine the defense case. If I were a defense attorney in a situation like that, I would take some of the statements that the mayor said and try to echo them in a closing argument. Say that they were under tremendous pressure, they were working hours on end because their budgets were constrained, that they did the right, and he did the best that he could under the circumstance. It also, right, that those sort of statements by a city executive undermine theories of prosecution that depend on omission, right? That depend on a failure to help, saying that there's no affirmative duty to help in this situation by the officers who refused to give him medical care because there was a policy that made it work out in the end. So I said that these sort of blame shifting and accountability mechanisms raise the question of what does it mean for who gets prosecuted? Which police officers tend to get prosecuted? And Professor Kate Levine at Cardozo Law School has written on this. She has an interesting short article recently pointing out that often those who are charged are young officers of color. For example, in Minnesota, one of the few convictions for a police officer shooting a victim was a Somali American police officer, Bahaman Noor, who was convicted for shooting a white woman. So Professor Kate Levine argues that when we prosecute the police, we're replaying the racial pathologies in these prosecutions that exist in the criminal justice system anyway, and at the same time permit politicians to shift blame to bad apples while failing to accept any systemic reform. And I'll mute this while the sirens are outside my house. Apologies, I live next to a fire station.
Thank you, Tony. So, yeah, and thank you for laying out the reasons why sometimes or often, most of the time, these cases don't end up in a conviction either because of charging decisions or the prosecution itself. So let's, Athena, I think wants to chime in here. Is that right? Or you're muted, Athena.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, Tony mentioned the power dimensions, but I think those are really important, right? And what that means on the ground. Tony gave us some examples, but I think not only do you have blame shifting, right, between the police and city officials, et cetera, you also have some interesting power dynamics. And we saw that with de Blasio and the NYPD when those police officers were killed a number of years ago, and they turned their backs, and it became really clear that they were not just showing disrespect, but were threatening in some sort of way not to protect. We heard that again with the NYPD around bail and certain kinds of reforms. When there was talk about, well, we just won't arrest folks. So there's some interesting power dynamics there. And it makes you, I think we should question, what is the role of the police as the kind of coercive but protective arm of the state? So power. Second thought is also, it seems to me we have to kind of be real about the power differences between police and citizens, and particularly citizens in communities of color. So I was having a conversation with a young man, and I've had a bunch of these conversations, but one I remember in particular, this young man was at this organization that I will speak about that focuses on police, And the group was talking about, training again, not for police, but training citizens to know your rights. And this young, smart, lovely young man just looked at me kind of in defeat. I guess that's why I remember it, in defeat. And he said, those police officers don't want to hear you talk about your rights. You say, I have the right to, and they beat you over the head. They don't respond to, another Know Your Rights campaign. And we are, getting systematically abused. And then he left and I never saw him again. He never came even back to the organization because he just thought, I've been picked up by the police 4 or 5 times. And so those realities about power. And the last thing that occurred to me when you were talking was how cynical some of this stuff can be. So, and I'd love to hear your reaction about the Michael Brown case in particular, because, and what that says about that notion. So I understand the case, and was this correct? That part of the officer's defense was that he acted in self-defense and he feared for his life. And if you look at the video, all right, so criminal law is not my area, but so as a layperson, when I look at the video, I see a young man who's actually fairly far from the police officer, turns around, walks, looks like he's raising his hand, and gets shot kind of multiple times. And the question becomes, well, and that became a thing, I think, in communities of color. Oh, just say you feared for your life. That becomes the stance of police officers who are charged with killing folks who are unarmed, some distance, or have their back turned, or whatever, that sort of stuff. And so really does kind of undermine any kind of trust, not only I think in the police, but also in the criminal justice system, right? So just wondering if you had any reactions to some of that.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, I think on Ferguson that you're absolutely right. I mean, 2 things. One is that there is a self-defense standard, and again, perhaps Professor Chiesa will want to get into the details, but if you do have a reasonable fear for your life, then you have that is a defense against homicides. And there is, I mean, depending on the jury pool that you have, right, they might be very receptive to this, to law enforcement officers who, at least as perceived by jurors, put themselves in harm's way. So it makes the cases, I think, substantively more challenging, and perhaps Professor Chiesa disagrees. But also, I think in these particular situations, there's something more going on. There is a lack of desire by the prosecutor to bring the charge, and they're using the grand jury in a fundamentally different way. If the grand jury acquits, or rather, if the grand jury declines to bring charges, then they can shift blame and say, I tried. And if the grand jury, after seeing even the exculpatory evidence and witnesses who are almost cross-examined by by the prosecutor to undermine their credibility, decides to bring the charge anyway, they can go to their superiors, or they can go to sort of if not the police union, at least maybe police leadership, and say, look, we needed to bring this case. This is a special case. This is a unique case. And maybe marshal some public support one way or the other. So one could be cynical and say that this is cynical, but I mean, I think actually I am espousing a cynical view. But you could imagine, even in cases where you want to bring the charge, having political pressures on you, given your relationships as a prosecutor with your police department, that would make you adopt this sort of strategy. And in terms of the young man you spoke to, I absolutely agree, right? That many people know full well what their rights are, but are correctly afraid to try to invoke them when they encounter police officers.
So May I before? So I just wanted to, say a couple of quick words on self-defense and actually the broader defense, which is use of force pursuant to law enforcement authority. So here, the defense in the vast majority, if not all of these cases, will either be self-defense, or it will be, I use deadly force and I was authorized to use deadly force pursuant to law enforcement authority. And I just want to flag something. We don't have time to discuss this. There's a weird thing here. It sounds paradoxical, maybe it's not, and there may be good reasons for this, but I just want to flag it without discussing it. And it is that there's something interesting about police being able to use more force to defend themselves than citizens, because police are armed, they're trained, and then citizens, and then citizens are allowed to use less force. So if you were to correctly apply the two standards, the self-defense for everyone versus law enforcement authority for police officers, self-defense is more restrictive. It has elements. There must be reasonable belief in an imminent attack, imminent, now. It must be that the use of force is necessary. There has to be proportionality. There's a bunch of elements that aren't there in the typical law enforcement authority standard. So the typical standard, which most states, not all, but Minnesota is one of them, has copied from Supreme Court Fourth Amendment jurisprudence on the use of force that violates the Fourth Amendment, is one where the standard is basically reasonableness. You can use deadly force if it's reasonable under the totality of the circumstances to use deadly force. And of course, that means nothing. That means very little. In prior cases, a more liberal Supreme Court had a more demanding standard. In the Gardner case, there had to be a reasonable belief that life or limb was in jeopardy of the police officer or others. Now that isn't even part of the standard. Anyway, so what I wanted to say to Athena is, I mean, the substantive criminal law is clear. When I teach criminal law, I show my students videos of many of these killings, Gardner, and Tamir Rice. I mean, I show, and it's just obvious. If you're just a student of criminal law and you're applying law, force is unjustified under the standard, under any reasonable interpretation. So if they're not getting charged or they're getting acquitted, something's breaking down. And it's not the definition of offenses. It's not that. It's not law doing the work here, right? It's power dynamics. It's all of these other extra legal factors or indirectly legal factors that are conditioning the outcome. More so than the substantive law itself. However, I mean, standards of reasonableness are wishy-washy, so there's this question as to what goes into reasonableness. In the Michael Brown case, you had that video of the store, which was claimed that he was, robbing the store, and this is something that under substantive law you can take into account when assessing reasonableness. So there's a lot that can be smuggled into the concepts, obviously. But they seem fairly straightforward. The problem seems to go way beyond, the law and to, the power dynamics, as you point out, and other issues. I do want to say that we're already running a little bit late in terms of our of what we wanted to discuss. So I don't know, Athena, if you want to follow up or if we can move to the next topic. Actually, this next question, I welcome both of your input, but I was thinking that maybe Athena could field it first. And it's so this is pivoting from law to other issues in this context. And one is that, as I'm sure that you are all aware, some people respond to the Black Lives Matter movement by saying, oh, it's not Black Lives Matter, it's all lives matter, right? I would like to hear your thoughts on whether, whether this is an appropriate response, why or why not. So do you have any thoughts on that, Athena?
I have so many thoughts on that. And I will try to bring in some other issues, and I want to try to link to some of the things that I've said and some things that you've said about, well, it's not the words on the paper, because that's how I'm interpreting. It's not the substantive law. That's not what the law says. And I think we need to think about how the law gets interpreted. and then how it is practiced on the ground, which was a lot of what you were saying, Tony. Here are these relationships, here are these procedural rules that make this difficult, et cetera, and then what that means and what is the context. So what's the context which shapes how those procedures are kind of interpreted and applied? What is the context that shapes how we understand the substantive law? Okay, and so I will touch on that in kind of responding a bit to this question about all lives matter. But first, let me just do some quick thank yous. Luis, obviously, thank you for organizing this. Tony, thank you for participating. This is really interesting, and so I'm enjoying myself. I'd also like to thank a group of people that work with the organization called Black Love Resist in the Rust. Black Love Resist in the Rust. And this is a group of young people that the organization is an organizing entity. It is kind of intentionally for kind of a political space for Black and Brown people from the ages of about 14 to 15 to 50, but it's really something like 18 to 40. And their goal is Black liberation, Black Brown liberation. Their focus is policing. And so almost everything that I know about policing, or the way that I think about it in this moment, has been shaped by this group of young people, and they are truly terrific. And they are doing at least one campaign. They have other campaigns where they're talking about how do we redefine safety, that I think is really much related to some things that we'll talk about later. I also want to thank some of my Facebook folks because they helped me strengthen my arguments. So I want to, this might be a good time to just show you some images, because I think we're in a really interesting moment and people are, as my sister-in-law likes to say, seeing things, and maybe seeing things more clearly. And so a lot of these images you have seen. So Brandon, might you go through those first, just kind of, I've been collecting these memes, comments, and memes, comments, comics, and that sort of stuff. So you've seen this. This is kind of what this moment is producing on social media. You know what this is about. I'm not gonna, you can just kind of run through them, Brandon. I'm not gonna really talk about them. I just kind of wanna show what's going on. So that's the first one. Next, the next one. This is really about disparities in treatment, all right? Next, again, disparities in treatment. The top row of folks actually killed people. The others allegedly did something and they received death sentences. Death sentences. They died, right? These are all the folks that have been killed by police. This is not all the folks, but this is a picture of some folks who have been killed by police, and this picture has been kind of going around. Next, what else do I have this? A picture of the moment we're in, kind of a rebellion, uprising, and context. Next and last, and we can kind of stop here because this really relates to the moment of protest. Okay, so what is my response? And you can kind of pull those down or you can leave them, you know. So what is my response? When folks say to me, you know, I say something about Black Lives Matter or something like that, and their retort is, all lives matter. I usually smile and say, you know what? An 8-year-old boy once said to me, if all lives really mattered, we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter. He was 8. This is not a deep concept, right? If all lives really mattered, we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter. And so for those folks who really are asking a question and those folks who think of themselves as kind of allies or want to be allies, my response, learned from activists on the ground, is Google it. Google it. If you don't know, Google it. And what you're going to find was this was a term that was coined by three Black women in reaction to the acquittal of George Zimmerman of the murder of Trayvon Martin, and really took off after Michael Brown was killed. And they say kind of what is some of the language that they use. Let's see if I can kind of put my hand on it. They say that, and this hashtag, this refrain, and this movement is an ideological and political intervention in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. And it is an affirmation of Black folks' humanity, our contributions to this society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. So people who really don't know, consider themselves allies, do some work on that. Figure it out, Google it, it's all there. For the others, I think the retort is simply just a negation of this idea that Black lives matter. And it's an interesting rhetorical move, sort of like color blindness, right? It has this kind of feel good sound to it, right? And you say, well, of course, that sounds right. It certainly sounds aspirational, but it's a lie, right? It's a lie in terms of the social reality. And it's really kind of interesting, like colorblindness. So in this society, nobody's colorblind, right? The society is so racialized and so racist. Your kids are not colorblind, you are not colorblind. It's not possible. But colorblindness, like All Lives Matter, does make some interesting moves. And what it really does is reinforce the social hierarchy, really reinforces that status quo. So when folks say All Lives Matter, they're also doing something very interesting. They're refocusing the attention on them, because they're usually white, but not always. All Lives Matter means I matter. But it's an interesting rhetorical term because it centers whiteness in a particular way, right? It centers whiteness as the generic human being. But we know the generic human being in Western society is the white person. And so it does all of this kind of work of reinforcing the social hierarchy, reinforcing the status quo, reinforcing these things while pretending really to say something else. And so that's an interesting kind of notion. A lot more can be said on that, but we know that in fact today that Blacks kind of on every single social and economic matrix fare far worse than most whites. And it doesn't matter what matrix you look at, whether it's on health, income, home ownership, and certainly with regard to arrest, incarceration, the length of sentences that people receive, and those who are killed by police officers. So all lives do not matter. Again, the reaction becomes, if all lives really mattered, we wouldn't have to say Black lives matter. And then I think in this particular moment, we're also seeing the reality of that more clearly. So we've got three intersecting crises. We've got the pandemic, we've got the economic pause and decline or crisis of some sort, and then we have this kind of unrest. And in each of those crises, what we see is that Blacks, Indigenous folks, Latinx, and other people of color are far more likely to become really sick due to COVID-19, to both catch it, become really sick by being hospitalized, and dying from it. In the economic realm, Trump had a press conference the other day where he celebrated the decreasing unemployment rate, only to be asked, well, didn't the Black unemployment rate go up? To which his response, like All Lives Matter, says, shh, shh. I'm celebrating. Unemployment rate went down, no matter that the unemployment rate for Blacks went up. And then we have this unrest really triggered by a police killing of a Black man. And in these protests, folks are calling out three names: Arbery, Taylor, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And then they're also referencing a Karen moment with regard to the Central Park incident with Amy Cooper. And so I think one of the things we have to ask is, what holds those things together? Are those just random events? Why do they strike us as similar? What makes those things look like they are connected? I leave that, I'm sure we'll come back to that. Still, a lot of people do try to explain and justify and kind of react in a really kind of positive way to the retort, all lives matter. For instance, and I think there's a slide number 9, people have said things like, and there was a great picture of a little girl who was holding up a sign saying, we said Black Lives Matter. We didn't say only Black Lives Matter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Trying to explain a concept that's relatively easily understood, and certainly you can easily find out about it. But so the explanation is for a group of people who will likely not be persuaded. And so, Brendan, with slide number 9, then you have a minister saying, well, you know, if my wrist is broken, of course, all my bones matter, but the focus is on my broken wrist. Right? The slide, which I don't know where it is right now. This person explains that, well, that response is like saying that the fire department should spray down all the houses in the neighborhood, even though only one house is on fire, because all houses matter. Yes, your house matters too, but your house is not on fire. And so we do have people who are willing to try to take the time to develop analogies and try to explain the concept. But for now, and I'll leave it at this, my response tends to be just to smile and say, as an 8-year-old once said to me, if all lives really mattered, we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter. So.
Thank you very much for that, Athena. And I think I want to pivot if possible, because it's already 4, but this is related actually. What I want to do is, as is usually the case in these panels, sort of like consolidate some of the questions that we were thinking and just having a more of a free-ranging discussion around those topics, and then we can open it up to Q&A. And I think one that I think is linked to this question you just answered, Athena, although I think it's a little bit more nuanced and complicated, is that a popular response to the protests has been that of support for the protests, but very sharp criticism of the violence, of looting, violence. And actually, I want to bring something to the attention of the panelists, but also to the attendees. And actually, I'm gonna, I can't screen share it. I'm disabled from doing it, but Martin Luther King III, MLK Jr.'s son, as I'm sure you're aware, tweeted, as my father explained during his lifetime, a riot is the language of the unheard, right? To which he got a really, really pathetic sort of like, response of sort of like white-splaining from different white people saying, oh, your father was a brilliant man, but we wouldn't condone the riots. And then someone else, this quote is taken out of context. The great MLK would never, and this was in response to MLK's son saying, as my father said, right? So I've noticed this continuously in the news reports when talking to different people. And I'm actually let me see if I can put this up here. Yeah, so this is,
Yeah, I saw that.
right? So this is the tweet, and these are some quotes, and there are many, right? Like that. So I guess I would, beginning with you, Athena, and then the rest of us can chime in, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you relate to this question.
Yeah, so I am, as you would expect, I'm tough on this. So my reactions tend to be, first, I usually start, because I get this all the time, and I think it's interesting, but I tend to start by saying, well, I think I agree with the Boston Tea Party. That's usually how I frame it, on the assumption that most people know what the Boston Tea Party is, right? In that event, $1.7 million in property was destroyed. It was tea. And these people were protesting, at least the way we learned it in elementary school, taxation without representation. So I usually start there and I say, well, yeah, Boston Tea Party, I kind of believe in that response. And so what that means is that I think that looting and violence is a valid response to oppression. It's a valid response to oppression. And so there's a great quote of, again, it's another tweet or something from a Simile. And she says, we do not have to peacefully protest our own genocide. We just don't have to peacefully protest our own genocide. We can do more than peacefully protest, and who is making that demand? So I usually start there. Looting and violence is a valid response, a valid political response to oppression. And that's not advocating looting, that's not advocating violence, but it is saying that's a valid response. And so when we think about, and this is how I, especially in my conversations with African Americans, especially African Americans from the middle class, right? When we think about the fact that we are protesting peacefully, overwhelmingly, the media really picked up on that. The overwhelming majority of the protesters are peaceful. That's really to our credit. Now, but that's a tactic, right? Looting violence is a valid response to oppression. Then you've got to decide whether or not you're going to use those tactics. So Dr. King said, not only did he say rioting is the voice of the unheard, but he also said he was kind of very pragmatic at some point. He said, well, folks, we're kind of 13% of the population, and engaging in some sort of war is probably not a very good idea. Very pragmatic. But one of the things we find with Dr. King is over time, he really became committed philosophically, right? Committed philosophically and in his kind of spirit to the practice of nonviolence. And that's inspiring. A lot of those people around him, nonviolence was a tactic. It was a tactic, right? And when it appeared that it didn't work, those people chose other tactics in response to oppression. Completely legitimate, right? So I think we need to kind of be clear about that. And some folks argue, and I think this is true, Dr. King would not have been successful with his nonviolent protest had you not had people like the Deacons of Defense who committed to bringing arms and protecting protesters, all right, given the context. So just kind of intellectually, I think, okay, we've got all of these different tools to contest and protest and challenge oppression. How do we decide that as a tactic? And if we have decided we are going to use nonviolence and we're going to be peaceful, then I say that is to our credit. Not because someone told us, not because the state is demanding, it's because we have chosen that tactic. And so we should not defer. So what I hear folks saying all the time is, well, it's the law. We've legalized all kinds of oppression. That's not an excuse. We don't have to defer to that. We can make a decision about that. And I think we do, and I think we do for mixed reasons, but I think we should be more clear about that. I guess the other thing that I get is this thing, and this is how it gets framed, is this question about, but they're burning down their own community. Have you all heard that? They're burning down their own community. I always focus on the word they, because they means that the person speaking is not in the streets, is probably on their couch. But my response to that is usually, are you sure those are our communities, or are we just renting space? Right? Are we just renting space? A lot of times we don't own those communities, and that is not unintentional, right? So I read some statistics where Black folks only own about 1% of the property, 1% of the land. And I remember reading that 20 to 25 years after enslavement, in some states, kind of 20% of the people, 20% owned about 20% of the land. In places like Texas and places like Florida, what happened to that land? It was taken. It was taken. We had 1% because that land was taken. And that's not unusual. When the Japanese Americans were put in concentration camps, white folks just moved into those houses out in the West. They just moved into their houses. They just took them, right? But this is a place where we took a whole continent, right? We are sitting very comfortably talking about communities on kind of looted land, built up by looted labor of stolen people. So the taking is not that unusual. And so then we get to kind of come to the modern moment. Again, Black folks accumulated some property. In 2008, different mechanism, same stuff, subprime lending, and then foreclosure wiped out the Black community. So the question becomes, are you sure those are our communities? Are we just renting space? And then you get other concerns about small businesses. That is some interesting stuff in that area. And we can talk about that. But you've also got in this moment redefinitions of looting, right? So the other thing I hear is, what does taking a 14-inch TV have to do with the protests? And we can talk about that some more, but it's a kind of an interesting question. But the other thing that you see is people redefining looting. And so I've got a couple of slides there. I think they are 14 and 15. And again, just some person on the internet says this must be the looting everyone is talking about. American billionaires got $434 billion richer during the pandemic. Another says, I gotta be honest, the worst looting I've ever seen take place happened just a few weeks ago when corporations collected over, he says 500 billion, but we can say $1 trillion in stimulus money, while everyone else was left with a $1,200 check. So I'm blowing it up. Can you see? I'm starting to try to connect the issues of policing with the larger structure of society. And so that's my response. Looting violence is a violent response. We may decide not to use it for a variety of reasons. Those are tactical reasons. Some people may do it because they're committed to nonviolence. Others may do it because they really are scared of what others might say, but it's a choice and it's a tactic. And then other things happen, I think, that we can respond to. And I am, trying to, in a very superficial way to make those connections. Reactions, thoughts?
Something very, very quickly that comes to mind is that one way of, and I think I actually saw this in one of the slides that you showed, but one way of pointing out the different framings is, are we going to see the violence as political violence? That's the Tea Party analogy, right? It's just political violence, and political violence is different in nature from, run-of-the-mill criminal violence as people think about it, right? So those are two paradigms for us to think about the violence, and the people who just very sort of like knee-jerk fashion say, oh, this is inappropriate, are not seeing, either not seeing or doing something worse, purposely doing something. But let's just talk about the people who are not seeing that there's a framing decision that is made, right? That prior to actually coming to a conclusion regarding appropriate or inappropriate, one needs to frame the violence as either, just run-of-the-mill criminality or political violence. And I think that a lot of people have failed to understand that, there's violence and there's violence. And yeah.
Right. And even though you can kind of divide it, you can make a distinction between political violence and criminal violence, right? It's one, very messy on the ground, right? As one of the women, there's a video of someone when talking about this, and she says there's three kinds of people. They're the protesters, they're the looters, and they're the people who just want to muck up stuff. So on the ground, that looks kind of messy, but I also think it's messy intellectually. And I think it's messy because, and she alludes to that, and I am alluding to that. That is, what makes the criminal? What makes the person who goes in to steal the 14-inch TV? Is it just, opportunity? Is this person just a thief, inherently a thief? Or what is it about the way the society is organized that might make that opportunity seem a good one, right? I'm going to take the opportunity to get what I can get because I can't get this stuff otherwise. That might be one. The other thing, of course, we saw in this is we also saw kind of white nationalists coming in to do what, to create violence and to discredit the movement, right? That's the other function of focusing on looting, which I try to encourage African Americans not to do. Think about it, come to terms about how you feel about it, but also know that the conversation and the focus on looting does two things. One is meant to discredit the movement and to distract your attention. Don't be distracted, all right? And the second thing it does is justify violence. It justifies the state bringing in the police. That's the goal of focusing. And you saw this a lot on certain channels, right? The only thing they focused on was the looting and the violence. There's a reason for that. Then you don't have to deal with whatever it is that people are protesting here, police violence against African Americans, indigenous people, and people of color. That's the focus. They want to focus on that. So they focus on the violence and the lootings because it discredits and it distracts. And so presumably, who knows, these white nationalists were trying to provoke that sort of response, although it may be more complicated than that. And then what we saw was kind of the state react, and the state reacted, of course, with the police. So police violence triggered this whole situation, and then the state reacted with bringing in more police. And as someone said, even in a protest about police brutality, the police can't help themselves and are still kind of violent. And we saw a lot of actions of that. So your distinction of political violence and then just criminality, I think is a good one to begin the conversation. But we need to look at that criminality piece and figure out what that is about, because it's much more complicated, I think. And it says something about social arrangements and our social environment and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The one thing I would add to this is that when people sort of praise the nonviolent protests of the 1960s, I think it invisibilizes like a lot of the violence that was occurring, which was state violence. If you look at some of these images of dogs biting protesters and protesters getting hosed, the same protesters who were afraid for their lives when they were driving down, like, basically the only highway in Mississippi where I have family and know pretty well, and it's hard to get out at the time from Jackson to like Hattiesburg. You are just ignoring the fact that it's a question of the distribution of violence and who's committing the violence. And those protests, they're not like the sort of Dr. King model, was basically sort of the subjection of oneself to an incredible amount of violence. And it required tremendous forbearance to actually get away from that. And I think that the way that state violence is being used now in the form of the police responses to protests is really telling. I think this reason why this moment is particularly is particularly compelling to many people is what it lays bare. And here it is the use of state power by police, but you might not even call it state power, and I'll get to what I mean by that in a second. What you've seen in terms of what the police have done in these protests, I mean, it was precipitated by like a brutal killing of George Floyd that was videotaped. In response, right, in DC, Trump deployed the National Guard. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday saying that the National Guard leaders were particularly violent against protesters in order to herald off the 82nd Airborne from being deployed against protesters. There were bullets by state reserved for different protesters. And these protesters were beaten in tear gas. In New York, the NYPD kettled and beat protesters who had nonviolent protesters who had no opportunity to peacefully leave. And they arrested 700 people, arrested and incarcerated, right, in jail, rather. They didn't issue desk appearance tickets, right, which is the easiest thing to do given the current bail laws. It is what, to its credit, the Buffalo Police Department seems to be doing, our prosecutor seems to be doing in this sort of situation, and in coordination with the police department. They arrested, and they did this in a city that has the highest rate of COVID-19 in the world, right? And the highest death rate in the world. And it's worth asking what this tells us. I think it has a lot to tell us about the links between COVID-19 and these protests, which we can talk about if we have time. But one other thing that it reveals, I think, is something about the police in the United States. Another New York Times article that is on our reading list for the audience by Amanda Taub quotes a really provocative professor of genocide at the University of College London, Kathleen Cronin-Furman, and I was discussing these issues with her, and her suggestion is that it seems to reveal that here, what the police are violent militias that are only partially controlled by the state, right? Only partially controlled by their governments. And that might be what is particularly terrifying here. And not only is it only partially and incompletely controlled, but incompletely controlled in an ethnically diverse society where the people who are in the militia have been conditioned to view some ethnicities and some people as subhuman. And that is the recipe for terrifying and unchecked violence. And I think that's why this is particularly telling. Here, and the state of failures to control the police are also really worrying, right? Professor Matuha-Athena mentioned de Blasio, right, and his relationship with the NYPD then turning their backs. I mean, as recently as February, the Sergeant Benevolent Union, one of the largest NYPD unions, threatened his life, declared war on de Blasio, right? In a letter on Facebook that same union published about these protests, they said, we will win the war on NYC, right? They will win the war on their city. Even Cuomo, right, depending on who you believe, called the police commissioner, the NYPD police commissioner, and the police chief, and apologized to him for saying some mildly condemnatory words. This isn't the behavior of people who have complete control over these institutions. And that, I think, is something to really keep in mind.
So if I may, I would like, and Athena, if you want to chime in on this, that's fine too. But I would like, it's 4:23. This runs until 5. We don't have a bunch of questions right now, so we can talk for a little bit more. If more people want to ask questions, start using that Q&A button there on your Zoom account. But what I would like to do between now and answering questions is briefly, very briefly, because of time constraints, talk about, okay, so we're trying to understand a little bit about the protests. We're trying to understand, what the movement is about. We're trying to understand what the state's response is about. And, but now I would like to talk about, very briefly about, well, so where do we go from here? And what are the demands? What are the asks that those of us involved in this movement have? And one that's becoming increasingly common, and that is receiving a lot of media attention, is the one on defunding or abolishing police departments. And I would like for us to have a brief conversation. We can have a whole panel or 5 or 10 on this, but just a brief conversation to sort of like talk about what this may mean. What does defunding or abolishing the police means, or is this appropriate? What would this look like? So I hand that off to both of you, and I'll chime in, as well.
I'm happy to take the first stab at it, though I know that Athena is thought very deeply about this, so I don't want to take too much time. I mean, I guess first of all, we could discuss what is meant by defund the police, right? And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want to say that we have to operate on my own understanding of it, because there are many different understandings. There's a tradition of radical abolition that dates from the 1960s that has been developed by intellectuals of color and activists of color, talking about really abolishing the police and trying to find new forms of local governance. A common way of saying it now that might be slightly less radical, that sort of Alex Vitale has said, and that a organizer of Defund the NYPD, Luis Flores, has said, is that we should take money away, and I'm quoting Luis Flores here right now. Let's take money away from institutions of racism like policing and give it to new policies that will address racism instead. And that means reducing the budgets of the police, because you're shrinking the job of the police. You're shrinking the mandate and handing a lot of their responsibilities over to other institutions that are perhaps, right, perhaps with an asterisk, less infected by systemic racism. Is it appropriate response? Well, at least for me, right? Call it whatever you want, but radical restructuring, at least in my view, is extremely urgent, and it's for me because of the question of whether these departments are incompletely controlled by the police. Now, there are reform measures, right, that Black Lives Matter movement have endorsed, sort of, or depending on how you define that movement, 8 That Can't Wait, right? There are measures that you can do that are data-driven, right, that do reduce violence against communities of color. Things like requiring de-escalation, banning chokeholds, warning before shooting, right? These are reforms, right? And the reforms that, when there's political will to implement, work, right? So, so why defunding then, right? In my view, right, it is because of the real risk of incomplete control of police officers, right? If you look at historical templates of defunding, right, of abolishing police departments, one is New York during the Progressive Era, right, where the state of New York abolished the New York City Police Department. And it was largely ethnic politics, really. I mean, it was the Progressive Era when the people who controlled the state were white Protestant, and a lot of New York City was controlled by Tammany Hall, right, and particularly ethnic Irish, right, at the time. And that was a real ethnic conflict. And to disempower that constituency, right, they abolished the police and they replaced it with the Metropolitan Police. There are lessons to learn from that. A lot of those police officers that were in the New York City Police Department formed non-state militias, right, the gangs of New York, that wreaked terrible violence on these communities, right? So you have to be careful about what it means, right, and what comes after it. But if you think about state power and state control and accountability and how it links to money, to my mind, that is the most compelling justification for substantially shrinking, at the very least, the footprint of police departments.
So
Happy to talk further if no one has anything to say, but I want to hear from others.
So,
is there anything that do you want to follow up on this?
no, yeah, I've got it. Had to unmute, right? Trying to figure out how to unmute. I think that's really interesting, Tony. And so I'd like to talk to you some more about that, about this incomplete control, because I think that of the police department, because I think that really frames a lot of what we're seeing in a lot of places. This arm of the state, right? They embody the coercive kind of power of the state, saying, well, we can turn on you, or we can refuse to protect you, etc. So I think that's really interesting. I also want to come at the defund the police, but I want to do it in a different kind of way. And I just want to pose some questions, and then I'm going to talk about what kind of reforms they talk about, or not really reforms, or steps toward a lot of times abolition. And I think that one of the things that people have to ask themselves is, what is the purpose of the police? What is the purpose of the police, really? And what kind of skills do they have? What are they trained to do? I think you're going to find out they're trained to engage in force, right? That's what they're trained to do. And they may have some other kinds of training. They may know how to, resuscitate people, but basically their training is in force. They're a force kind of violence. The second thing, so people need to ask that, what's the purpose of the police and what are they trained to do? What a lot of people will say is they are trained to protect us. They're the ones that keep us safe. And I think a lot of the folks who are abolitionists, or who really agree with this kind of defund the police idea, are making a different kind of argument there. They're saying they're really not making us safer. They're a force of violence in our communities. They're not making us safer. And I think people find that startling. They find that a startling idea. They also find this notion of defunding the police really startling. Not curious enough to find out what it means, but they find it really startling. And at first, so did I. And so when you're kind of thinking about safety, we might also think about the history of the police. And it's something that I've tried to bring in this conversation, and I'm not so sure successfully, but if we look at the history of the police, what we find is that and a lot of people say this, but they haven't really thought about it. Their purpose is, using force, is to protect property, to protect wealth and the wealthy. That's kind of what their history has been. And part of the way you do that is controlling the labor force and controlling working people. And in the North, they did it through initially kind of private guards. When you see the emergence of the industrial worker in the North, had a lot of immigrants in it. They were marginal people. This background to the police was meant to kind of keep them in control. In the South, you had slave patrols. Another labor force you're trying to keep control of. That's the history of the police in the United States. And then this idea about, well, they should deal with street crime maybe comes later, but they don't really deal with street crime. And so we need to understand what that argument is, how that works. We need to think about it a little more, I think, systematically. So the third thing is kind of a more modern argument. And so a lot of abolitionists would say, how do we redefine safety? Because these people don't really keep us safe. How do we do that? And one of the things that we see, kind of one of the leading causes of murder, there's been very few studies done, but one or two that have been done, the leading cause of murder is kind of personal conflict, right? It's not the random person who comes and kills you in the middle of the night. That happens, but that's rare. It's really kind of interpersonal conflict. And so then how do we deal with interpersonal conflict? You don't need to bring guns to the conversation. You don't need to bring guns to the battle. And so we need to look at that. Okay, so I'm throwing out a lot of ideas. Let me kind of pause and end on this notion. And so in my mind, the idea about defunding the police from this other perspective is really quite reasonable. That is, if you figure out that the police actually don't make us safe, then you might not need them. We'll come back to that. But there's another thing that's going on in the modern moment, and it goes back to something that both of you said earlier, and that has to do with kind of city, state, and local, city, state, and kind of federal policy and their failure to deal with the real issues that face us as a country, right? So what they've done is shoved it off on the police. An agent that is kind of a force of violence or a force of coercive power has been given responsibilities to resolve homelessness. That's a failure of the state, right? What can police do about homelessness, right? They can go in, they can tear down homeless people's tents. They can burn them down. They can go and they can push homeless people and shove them out of the way so we don't see them. They can, even when they're polite, they can escort them to a shelter if there is space available, but they don't have the tools to deal with homelessness. That's a political issue and our politicians have failed on that. Same with the schools. Do we really need police in schools? A coercive force of the state to come in with their guns to do what, right? We really probably need more counselors, more social workers. We need to allow teachers to be teachers, but we need to create the kinds of spaces in school where kids and young people really learn. And we need to really throw our resources in that. So what does that mean? That means you take the resources from the police, right? Because in Buffalo and most cities across this nation, our priorities and our values have to do with policing. You take this money from the police, but you also take the responsibility from them, right? That they can't solve anyway. Take the responsibility of making schools function. Take the responsibility of homelessness and housing. Take the responsibility of dealing with mental illness. Another leading cause of murder is mental illness. What can police do about mental illness? Take all of those responsibilities from police officers and put them where they belong, right? On our communities and on our society and on our government to help us solve those issues. Take the money from the police, stop a third of our budget, and put it in schools and put it in mental health and put it in housing, affordable housing, and not in policing, because these people are trained to shoot. And if you start thinking about that and you start training people, not training people, but having people try to imagine what it means to use other kinds of techniques to solve our conflicts, then you might find that you get to a place where you really don't need that force, right? You don't need police in that sort of way. And so from my perspective, all of the arguments make sense to me. But for most people, that argument is, it tends to make sense, that we need to switch our priorities, that we need to change our values in dealing with the police. And then last, I would leave you with, where are the safe neighborhoods? What do they have? What do they look like? You know, and so again, there's somebody had some tweet or something, and it goes something like this: it's hard to start a riot when everybody has a good job, money in their pockets, access to good education and health care, and the police are protecting the innocent instead of murdering them. This isn't about Antifa or protesters or outside agitators or looters. This is about the system. And so we need to change the system, and defunding the police, right? And reallocating that money, because that's the other half of the sentence. Defund the police and reallocate the money toward the things that we need. And I'm not really talking about social services in the way that we know it, but really thinking creatively about building resilient communities, right? If we defunding the police and building and reallocating the resources and building these resilient communities seems to me to be the way to go. That's a perfectly reasonable approach. And that might lead us to abolition. So I'll stop that. Think about where the good neighborhoods are. Mm-hmm.
So I want to move on now. It's 4:38. We have about 22 minutes
Okay,
for questions.
questions.
I wanted to say something briefly about this issue, which I haven't said anything about, and then move on to questions. First, one thing that hasn't been mentioned is, but it's on people's minds, but I think they're connected, and it's the connection between the issues regarding abolishing or defunding the police, the issues that give rise to that, and the substantive criminal law, right? I mean, one of the reasons, not the only reason, it may not be the chief reason, but one of the reasons why we have so much policing in part is because we have so much crime. And so, I mean, by crime, I don't mean crime committed, but crimes on the books. We have so many regulations that
Yes.
make so many different things criminal. And these regulations, especially misdemeanors, and especially the least, disturbing of the misdemeanors, but misdemeanors in generally have historically been used to target historically oppressed communities. And these things change from generation to generation. So, some time ago it was vagrancy. That was shut down. That was shut down by the U.S. Supreme Court. Then you had gang ordinances, and then you have in Ferguson, Missouri, you have manner of walking on the roadway, improperly walking on the roadway, and now we have in COVID social distancing guidelines, which we already saw have led to violent encounters between police and quite often Black and brown communities in this country. So I just wanted to flag that. I think this is relatively uncontroversial. I just wanted to flag that in at the same time that we're dealing with defunding or abolishing the police, we also need to be dealing with defanging the substantive criminal law, so that we go back to the core offenses that, we need a prohibition on homicide and rape and certain things, but we don't need improper manner of walking on runway or selling cigarettes to be a crime like Eric Gardner. We don't need that kind of thing because it just adds fuel to this policing fire. But we do have a lot of questions. It's 4:40. What I'm going to do is we won't be able to get through all of them, but I'll take a sampling of them, and I will actually, based on the topic, I will direct them to the person I think is best equipped to answer the question. So let me start with the following question. So there's a question here that I want to direct to Tony. I would like for us to keep answers short so that we can go through at least 4 or 5 questions.
Mm-hmm.
So one is, okay. So here a questioner asks, my question is, will giving a civilian review board or other police advisory boards independent subpoena power do anything? Or will all the conflicts of interest between DA and prosecutors continue even with civilian review boards? So do you have any thoughts on that, Tony?
I have a few, right? So I haven't, I know that many people who are serious reformers are very skeptical of the efficacy of civilian review boards. I mean, as a structural matter, yes, right? Absolutely, we should have them. We should have some sorts of mechanisms of accountability to police officers. There should be formal institutions in place that allow for some sort of oversight, right? And giving them subpoena power is like basically would add more teeth, right? In terms of just the establishment of boards, especially when there's either not subpoena power or when NYP, like when people are just resistant to it, you might be in a situation like New York City, where there's a widespread, I think, feeling among a lot of people that the Civilian Review Board doesn't really do much, right? And can't do much. It's useful if you can get discovery from the CCRB as a defense attorney when you're investigating the misconduct of a police witness. Sometimes it comes in handy. But in terms of what it's supposed to do as an effective mechanism of accountability and discipline, I worry, right? That doesn't mean we shouldn't have it. Yes, absolutely. But that gets to the idea that is sort of animating my thinking about a lot of these questions about who the police are accountable toward. I mean, thinking about Athena's really great summary of what defunding the police is, right? One could argue, right? You could imagine somebody coming back in response to this and saying, look, I completely agree with you about what the police should be doing and how, and what they shouldn't be doing. But the answer isn't just to eliminate a longstanding department with these rich institutions and just start from scratch. The answer is to you'll hear this, Professor Seth Stoughton, right? Change this from the mindset of police officers from a warrior mindset to a guardian mindset, right? The idea is to train these officers in mental health, change the way that you recruit officers so that you don't sort of select for violence, you select for de-escalation. Make police officers more like emergency response drivers in terms of what their training is and what their personality is. I mean, EMTs are the first people to arrive at the scene. They're not armed and they're great at de-escalating, right? Do this all, like reform the police, majorly restructure the police, have radical reform of the police, but make it still a large police department. And the same reason why I'm skeptical of sort of CCRBs without more, civilian review boards, without more is that, is because I worry about the political accountability of police departments and the degree to which we actually control those departments. So you can have whatever reforms you want, but if they're disregarded because of entrenched power, it's not going to do anything.
Right. Thank you.
I'm sorry, that wasn't as succinct as it should have been, but I'll do better.
So, Athena, I have a question here that I think I should direct at you. So, the question says, we're going to have it says that part of the conversation made the questioner feel that the criticisms of the looting and violence are emanating from people who don't have a stake in the matter, but that communities of color regularly express support, or some people in communities of color express support for more increased policing presence in their community, that there's a lack of effective policing in their communities. So right now the conversation, the questioner says, is focused on the over-policing issue, as it probably should be, but aren't we ignoring under-policing and the broader issue, which may lead us to paint too simple a picture of what's going on? So Athena?
Actually, that's a really, really good question. And you do hear that, and it's usually kind of it comes from a certain perspective, but you certainly hear this from African-American communities. Can't really speak to some of the others, that actually we need new police and we need better police, and that sort of stuff. And I think Randy Kennedy may have written a book on this notion sometime back. I'm pulling from way back around that. And I guess my reaction is, yeah, well, we're Americans and we're all brought up in this space, right? And so most of us can't even dream of what a world would be like without police. You can't imagine it. And I don't think anybody has the answers, because no matter what happens, we pick up and dial 911. And if the police come and mistakenly shoot us through our window because we're sitting there watching TV, or go to our backyard and we happen to have our phones out, then, that's the price we're willing to pay. I think that we have to start having conversation about what's the purpose of the police? And are there other kinds of what many would call kind of transformational notions of or practices of resolving conflict that don't require us to rely on the police? So when we talk about kind of interpersonal violence, domestic violence is one of the big areas, and the police get called to kind of mediate those kinds of conflict. Most of the scholarship at this point suggests that that is probably not the appropriate response. And so we have to dream. Yes. So yes, communities of colors are like all other communities. They say, well, we need more police in some sort of ways. But I think that those are some of the places where we see some of those young people and others starting to talk about, how do we reduce our reliance on police? How do we do something different? And that's going to take some time. That's going to take some resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to say which is not a great answer because none of us know what this society without police looks like. And if you're a young person, start thinking, right? Help us dream of, we've got a lot of steps. People have outlined steps that might get us there. But people need to start dreaming about what that looks like and what else do we need and what else do we need to be funding. I want to just kind of quickly say, this warrior language really bugs me with regard to the police, especially kind of in my community, right? Because it sounds like something noble. What's going down on the border, what you saw with the George Floyd, noting that the second most kind of frequent complaint about police is sexual abuse. We should be careful of the warrior language. Maybe all warriors do that, but it just seems to me it has something more noble than what we're actually seeing in terms of police. They're certainly noble in certain places and with certain people, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that's going on. And I guess even in response to maintain the police institution, make them like emergency service people. Why? We have those people. We have those people. Maybe those people need more resources, right? Maybe those people who come on the scene and have training with mental health, let them do it. Third, let me close this with, police are these are human beings and they're part of our community. And so we also need to think, if we're talking about defunding the police, what are these folks going to be doing? We've got a tremendous amount of work. The climate is changing. Our infrastructure is rated, the civil engineers gave it a D- or D+ a couple of years back. Our bridges are falling apart. Our sewage systems are falling apart. They still don't have water in Flint. There's something going on here. There is so much work that we need to do as a country. We can redeploy people doing all of this kind of infrastructure and climate change and Green Deal kind of work. And police may be really kind of suited for some of that. And so the idea is not to throw them out on the ground, throw them out with nothing. It is to redeploy and to think differently about how our society is organized. And of course, that's a really big dream. So I don't have a total answer to the questioner's question, because I think we have to dream that world, right? And we're kind of stuck in the world that we're in.
Thank you for that, Athena. So I think I'm gonna try in 2 minutes to take 2 criminal law related questions, and then I will shift to Tony for a question that relates to his bailiwick. So with regard to criminal law, I had a question about the reasonableness standard in self-defense and perhaps in law enforcement authority. And a question regarding, what does that mean? Is it a reasonable man, reasonable woman, reasonable police officer? That's $1 million question. It's unclear exactly what that means. It's a question that I like to think about as how much can you subjectify the reasonable person standard without it becoming a subjective standard, right? Because there's consensus that the standard is objective, whatever that may mean. But then at some point that you can't say the reasonable paranoid schizophrenic person, because that would just be the defense of insanity, right? You don't need reasonableness to get to that level of subjectivity. So the short answer is it's a reasonable person in the actor's situation. And that allows you to take into account different things about the actor. Objective features about the actor, like their height, their relative strength, are clearly taken into account. Gender is frequently often taken into account. And many more issues. Past experiences. If you recall the Getz case, the famous Getz case, the subway vigilante case, which in New York, in that case, we could take into account prior events in Getz's life, the fact that he had been mugged, the fact that the New York City in the 80s was a pretty violent place compared to what it is now. So we can take into account those things. But at some point, you have to stop, because then you're just objectifying the standard too much. So I don't want to say more about that because of time limitations. But in the case of police officers, clearly you would take into account their specialized training, obviously. And this will count against them, right? I mean, in other words, if I were faced with a threat I should have more leeway because I don't have any kind of training regarding whether this is a real threat or not, and et cetera. Whereas police officers are trained, they're paid to do this, right? So that training will be taken into account in this context. Okay, that's one. The second one, quickly, is, it's a question about balancing blameworthiness or apportioning blameworthiness, because here usually we have officers who do something horrible and then we go after them. But of course, this doesn't get to the systemic issues, right? Which are the ones that we've been mostly talking about here. So the question here is, well, okay, so we jail these people and then we have the same issues, right? At the end is, although the acts by the officers are abhorrent, the questioner says, what does jailing them for 40 years accomplish? That's a great question. It has to do with the purposes of punishment. I'm sort of like a prison abolitionist. I think that it's obscene that people go to jail for 40 years. Whether it's this officer, Derek Chauvin, which I think he shouldn't go to jail for 40 years, because I think first-degree murder shouldn't be punished by 40 years. We should go more with, let's say, the German Spanish model, where the maximum amount of punishment is capped at like 20 years, 25 years for the worst offense. So, I mean, what I want to say here is that it may be cathartic to punish certain people, and there are reasons why we may want to punish them, but clearly punishment is not the solution to any of these problems. And punishment historically has been the opposite of the solution to these problems, right? Because punishment is what has been used, in Michelle Alexander's way, incarceration, to create the new Jim Crow, right? So we, I think, should be very skeptical of punishment when it's used in either direction, right? But I mean, there are, reasons, expressive reasons primarily, why you do want to punish these actors. You want to express condemnation because it's exactly the kind of thing that the state hasn't expressed in the unequivocal way that we wanted to express it. Okay, so about that. I have a question here for Tony, which again, if we could keep it to a couple of minutes so I can smuggle in one last question, that would be great. We have 5 minutes. So Tony, it's about the jury selection process and whether you think that there are special dynamics that can be outcome determinative or outcome, impact the outcome in cases where officers are prosecuted.
I mean, absolutely, right? I'm not an expert on the Minneapolis jury pool. The only jury pool I have real familiarity with is Kings County, Brooklyn. I mean, there are people listening here who know more about the Erie County jury pool, but as a generality, right? A lot of times, jury pools are organized by county, whereas the majority of crimes prosecuted are in the urban center. And so what you have is a jury pool that is much wider than the people who are being tried. In police shooting cases, that's going to mean a jury pool that is going to tend toward more sympathy with the law enforcement, if I can sort of generalize broadly. So I don't have, I'll keep it at that in the spirit of being succinct, but yes, it's a huge issue.
Thank you, Tony. So the last question there then is for all of us, but I guess, I mean, Tony just answered and I answered a question, so we'll go back to Athena, and we just have 3 minutes, so maybe it's just going to be Athena. But this one goes to a topic that we didn't discuss, and it's, can we talk more? I'm sorry to do this to you, Athena, with 3 minutes left in the program, but can we talk more about police unions? And the question was about Buffalo Police Union and other police unions, and how they may or may not pose a barrier to the demands that communities have regarding defunding, restructuring, or abolishing policing. So with that question, we will end the program, and Athena, take us on.
All right, and I am actually going to toss it a bit because Tony wanted to really speak on unions, and I think he wanted to speak in defense of unions. And then I had a couple of quotes from the leadership of the Minnesota, Buffalo, several unions in New York City. I had a couple of quotes from their leaders and that I wanted Tony to consider. So I'm going to kick it to him since he's thought more about unions.
Thanks. So I've thrown out a few of the quotes that the unions have said against de Blasio. Again, declaring war on New York City. declaring or winning the war against New York City, against the people they're supposed to police, threatening de Blasio's wife, doxing his daughter when she was arrested for nonviolent behavior in a protest. There's no, I'm going to offer, if not a defense of unions, maybe a qualified list of things to consider. But that being said, let me begin by saying, I saw in the question, in some of the questions, people asking, aren't unions a hindrance? Absolutely, right? Police unions are in one, they resist legal accountability. They're a lobbying group that had successfully for a long time lobbied against even basic and humane reforms like banning chokeholds or repealing 15A, which thankfully our legislature has recently done, which 50A shields police officers' disciplinary records from public disclosure. But there's some really interesting debates and thinking about this, because if you're going to condemn police unions, it's an easy thing to do if you're anti-union, right? If you think that the problem is public sector unions, and because they're representing worker interests at the expense of their constituent interests, then your job is done, right? But if, I guess, like me, you're more sympathetic to unions, we're all in one, and I've been a labor activist for all of my adult life, you have to think about how to meaningfully distinguish and whether you can meaningfully distinguish this. And there's some really provocative abolitionists thinking about this. I can recommend Ben Levin's piece, What's Wrong with Police Unions? And it asks about what the problem is. Is the real issue that there's something wrong with police unions, or is the issue that there is something wrong with police and they happen to be in a union, right? And some people seem to think that if you get rid of police unions, it's going to get rid of a huge obstacle to reform and all sorts of things are going to pass. I'm very skeptical. If you have communities of color that are disenfranchised, where there's no political responsiveness to them, and you get rid of a veto point, it's not actually going to make anyone do anything, right? That's going to, it's going to maybe be a helpful sort of adjust the balance of power a little bit, but people can lobby quite effectively whether or not they are in a union, right? Police officers are still going to be police officers and they'll still have their First Amendment rights and a lot of public sympathy, whether or not they are organized into unions. And so I think that it is really worth pausing to think about whether we want to have what John Rappaport and Ben Levin calls a second order regulation of trying to attack a union in order to get to the root cause of the problem, when it might be that the real problem is our political responsiveness and what police are in the United States, right? It could be that going back to blame shifting, what I started with, and how people try to defer accountability, it could be that city government likes to blame things on unions, right? If you have calls by police officers, again, this is sort of Ben Levin's point, for increased pay and less accountability, it's easy to give them less accountability and then and to bargain that away so that you don't have to pay more or engage in or increase salaries. And doing that and then you can blame it on the union, right? Even Byron Brown, right? We have police unions, and it's telling that in the same interview with Rachel Maddow that I talked about before, he said the union's on the wrong side of history. Now, given like class political support that he's had for unions generally, this is a huge shift, right? This is a sea change, but it suggests that maybe it's not the union that was really the roadblock before.
Thank you. It's 5:02, and so we are going to bring this program to an end. Before we do so, I wanted to thank the law IT people who've been phenomenal, Terry and Tedros and Brandon and John, and a really, really big thanks to Lisa Mueller as well, who dealt with everything from the marketing to dealing with Q&A and the PowerPoint and everything. So huge props to Lisa and everyone on our staff who helped this. Also, obviously, to Athena and Tony. And I wanted to let you guys know that there will be more, as I mentioned at the beginning. The Buffalo Criminal Law Center and the law school will host more panels. I think one that will take place pretty soon is on this issue of police unions, precisely, maybe just having a panel devoted to that, or abolition. And we also plan to bring outside speakers from other law schools and you know, people who are law professors, different people from different places in different parts of the country. So this is a conversation to be continued, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. We had at one point over 150 people, so I think this was a success, and thank you all for joining, and again, thank you, Tony and Athena, for having this conversation with me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.